Hi, I'm John Kowalski. I work for ChemADVISOR Incorporated at the company's headquarters in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Recently there's been a lot of discussion regarding the need for reform of the Toxic Substances Control Act, and I wanted to take this opportunity to review for you what's already transpired and what you might expect going forward. Now, the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA as it is known, was originally enacted in 1976, and its purpose was to authorize EPA, that is the Environmental Protection Agency, to regulate both new and existing chemicals so as to prevent unreasonable risks to human health and the environment. TSCA was subsequently amended by the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act in 1986, by the Indoor Radon Abatement Act in 1988, and by the Lead Exposure Reduction Act in 1992. Each of these major amendments created new regulatory programs which were relatively narrow in scope. Over the years, committees within both the House and Senate with oversight responsibility for TSCA have held hearings and taken testimony, but after more than 33 years, the original legislation remains largely unchanged. However, there's a growing consensus that TSCA does need to be reformed and updated. And there are a number of factors that are contributing to that consensus. First of all, it's widely believed that TSCA has not kept pace with changes in the industry that it regulates, and that it has not fulfilled its original promise, particularly with respect to existing chemicals. In addition, a number of state and international chemical management initiatives have gone forward, and these have caused people to take a critical look at TSCA. There have also been a number of biomonitoring studies done, and these studies have detected hundreds of industrial chemicals within samples of human blood, urine, amniotic fluid, and breast milk. There's also a growing public concern regarding chemicals in consumer products, and that in turn has created growing pressure on retailers for information regarding the chemicals in the products that they sell. And finally, it may be necessary to amend TSCA in order for the U.S. to ratify some international treaties such as the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. In anticipation of a debate within Congress over TSCA reform, a number of organizations have already developed principles for TSCA reform. Among these would be the American Chemistry Council, the Society of Chemical Manufacturers and Affiliates, the Safer Chemicals Healthy Families Coalition, the U.S. Government Accountability Office, and 13 U.S. states. Going forward, we would expect that other organizations would develop their own principles to guide TSCA reform. The EPA released their 6 essential principles for reform of chemicals management legislation on September 29, 2009, and those principles are based upon the Obama administration's goals for TSCA reform. Now, to the extent that these various stakeholders have developed principles for reform, it's interesting to note that there are certain principles on which most of them agree, while there are other principles on which they disagree. But even in the case where most stakeholders agree on a given principle, there are disagreements over specific issues related to that principle. And this is going to make for a spirited debate when Congress does take up TSCA reform. To illustrate by example, most stakeholders agree that chemicals should be reviewed against risk-based safety standards, and that those standards should be protective of sensitive subpopulations such as pregnant women and children. Most stakeholders also agree on the need for a mechanism to prioritize chemicals for assessment, but they may not agree on the criteria to be applied. And finally, most stakeholders agree that EPA needs adequate funding to assess chemicals in commerce, but they may not agree on the source of that funding. So, where does all of this leave us in terms of what we might expect going forward? Well, we believe it's reasonable to conclude that TSCA will be amended, although the nature and the timing of those amendments remain to be seen. What's important is that any amendments to TSCA will potentially impact all companies that manufacture, import, process, use, or sell chemicals or products made from chemicals. That being the case, ChemADVISOR will be closely monitoring developments going forward, and we would recommend that any potentially impacted companies do the same.